August 23rd, 1942, 16:18 hours. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The sky turned black at 4 in the afternoon, not from clouds, but from wings. The Volga River had flowed for millennia, indifferent to empires, wars, and the ambitions of men. But in the summer of 1942, that ancient waterway became the single most important line on Earth. On one side, the Soviet Union, bleeding and desperate. On the other, Nazi Germany, hungry and overextended. Stalingrad wasn't just a city. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself, a symbol, a prize, a declaration. To Hitler, capturing it meant humiliating the Soviet leader and severing the Soviet Union's access to the oil fields of the Caucasus. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable, not just strategically, personally. The city stretched along the western bank of the Volga for nearly 30 miles, a sprawling industrial center of tractor factories, grain silos, and worker housing. 500,000 people called it home. Most of them had no idea they were about to become witnesses to one of history's most brutal battles. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler studied maps with the confidence of a man who believed destiny favored him. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun in June 1941 with overwhelming force. Blitzkrieg had shattered Soviet defenses. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured. Moscow had nearly fallen. Leningrad was under siege, but the Soviets hadn't collapsed, and now, in the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive, Operation Blue. The objective was clear: drive south, seize the oil fields of Baku, cripple the Soviet war machine. Stalingrad was supposed to be a secondary target, a flank protection, a footnote. It would become an obsession. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the German 6th Army, a force of over 270,000 men, hardened by 2 years of war. Paulus was methodical, obedient, a product of the German General Staff. He followed orders. He believed in the superiority of German tactics, German discipline, German steel, but he had never fought a battle like this. On the Soviet side stood General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army. Chuikov was 42 years old, blunt, aggressive, and utterly ruthless. He had one order from Stalin, delivered through the political apparatus with chilling clarity: there is no land beyond the Volga. Retreat was not an option. Survival was not guaranteed. Victory was the only acceptable outcome, even if it meant dying in the rubble. Throughout July and early August, German forces steamrolled across the southern Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe dominated the sky. Panzer divisions carved through Soviet defenses. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. By mid-August, the 6th Army was approaching Stalingrad. Soviet soldiers dug in along the outskirts. Civilians were ordered to evacuate, but many stayed, either because they had nowhere to go or because they believed the city would hold. Factory workers built barricades. Women and children dug trenches. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, roamed the streets with orders to shoot deserters on sight. The air was thick with tension and the smell of summer dust. On August 23rd, 1942, at 16:18 hours, that tension exploded. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, over 600 aircraft, descended on Stalingrad in the largest single aerial bombardment of a city since the London Blitz. Wave after wave of Heinkel, U-111 and Junkers Ju-87, Stuka dive bombers screamed over the rooftops. The sound was deafening. The destruction was total. Incendiary bombs ignited wooden buildings. High-explosive ordnance collapsed apartment blocks. The Volga riverfront became a wall of flame. Oil storage tanks ruptured, sending rivers of burning fuel through the streets. Smoke columns towered thousands of feet into the air, visible for miles. Civilians ran through the chaos, clutching children, searching for shelter that no longer existed. Soldiers scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns, firing blindly into the smoke-choked sky. The ground shook with each impact. The air itself seemed to scream. By nightfall, 40,000 civilians were dead. Stalingrad was burning, and the battle hadn't even begun. General Paulus watched the smoke rise from his command post kilometers away. The bombing had been devastatingly effective. Intelligence reports suggested Soviet morale was shattered. Resistance would be minimal. The 6th Army would enter the city, secure key positions, and complete the occupation within days. It was a reasonable assumption based on every previous German victory in the East. It was also catastrophically wrong. Paulus divided his forces for the assault. The 6th Army would attack from the north and west, pushing toward the Volga. The 4th Panzer Army, under General Hermann Hoth, would strike from the south. Together, they would crush the Soviet defenders in a classic pincer movement. The plan was elegant. The terrain was not. Stalingrad was not an open steppe where panzers could maneuver freely. It was an urban labyrinth of factories, apartment blocks, rail yards, and rubble. The bombing had made it worse. Collapsed buildings created natural fortifications. Streets became kill zones. Every window was a potential sniper nest. German doctrine emphasized speed, mobility, and combined arms. Tanks supported infantry. Aircraft provided close air support. Artillery prepared the battlefield. But in Stalingrad, those advantages evaporated. Soviet commanders understood this immediately. General Chuikov established his headquarters in a bunker carved into the Volga's western bank, directly across from the ferries that supplied his army. He was acutely aware that his back was against a river. There was no retreat, no fallback position. Either they held Stalingrad or they died in it. Chuikov implemented a doctrine he called hugging the enemy. The concept was brutal and brilliant. Keep Soviet forces so close to German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb without hitting their own troops. Engage the enemy at point-blank range. Turn every building into a fortress. Force the Germans to fight room by room, floor by floor, body by body. We will make them pay in blood for every meter, Chuikov told his officers. Not with our lives alone, but with theirs. Soviet defensive positions were organized into strongpoints centered around key buildings: the grain elevator, the Red October factory, the Barricade gun factory, and the tractor factory. Each became a fortress. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Anti-tank rifles waited in basements. Snipers took positions in the upper floors. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under cover of darkness. Small groups in boats and rafts ferried across under German artillery fire. Casualties were horrific, but the flow never stopped. Fresh troops arrived, exhausted, terrified, and immediately thrown into combat. The NKVD established blocking detachments behind the front lines, with orders to shoot anyone retreating without permission. Fear became a weapon pointed in both directions. Soviet propaganda painted the battle in existential terms. This was not just a military engagement, but a defense of the motherland itself. Soldiers received leaflets with slogans printed in bold letters: "Not one step back." Political officers gave speeches before attacks, reminding men that their families depended on them, that history was watching, that Stalin expected victory. Some believed it. Others simply had no choice. Meanwhile, German intelligence underestimated Soviet strength. Reconnaissance flights showed devastation, not resistance. Paulus believed the bombing had broken Soviet will. He ordered the assault to begin. On September 13, 1942, German forces entered Stalingrad in force. The 71st Infantry Division attacked from the north, pushing toward the Mamayev Kurgan, a hill that dominated the city center. The 295th Infantry Division advanced through the southern suburbs. My panzer units rumbled through the rubble, turrets swiveling, searching for targets. Soviet forces waited. The first German soldiers entered apartment blocks cautiously, rifles raised, eyes scanning shadows. They moved through rooms filled with furniture overturned by the bombing, a child's toy here, a family photograph there, reminders that this had been a living city. Then the shooting started. Soviet troops fired from windows, doorways, basements, rooftops. Germans returned fire, but the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A soldier would clear a room, move to the next, and be shot from behind by a fighter who'd been hiding in a closet or under debris. Panzers advanced down wide boulevards, only to be struck by anti-tank rifles firing from point-blank range. Molotov cocktails rained from upper windows. Mines hidden in rubble-crippled vehicles. Burning tanks blocked streets, forcing infantry to advance without armor support. The Luftwaffe bombed indiscriminately, but the rubble only created more hiding places. By nightfall, German forces had advanced several blocks. The cost was staggering. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan began on September 14th at dawn. Mamayev Kurgan was a natural hill rising 102 meters above the city, high enough to see the entire battlefield. Whoever controlled it controlled Stalingrad. Artillery observers positioned there could call down fire on any position. Command posts dug into its slopes were nearly invulnerable. The Soviets held it. The Germans needed it. General Paulus committed the 71st and and 295th Infantry Divisions to the assault, supported by panzer units and concentrated artillery fire. For 30 minutes, German guns pounded the hill. High-explosive shells pulverized Soviet trenches. The ground shook, trees splintered, the air filled with dirt and smoke. Then the infantry advanced. German soldiers climbed through the rubble in staggered lines, weapons ready, grenades hanging from belts. They moved with precision, drilled into them through years of training. Sergeants shouted orders. Platoons covered each other. Machine gunners set up firing positions. Soviet defenders opened fire. Maxim machine guns hammered from entrenched positions. Mortars launched shells in high arcs, exploding among the advancing Germans. Snipers picked off officers and radio operators. The first wave faltered, men diving behind rubble, dragging wounded comrades back. German artillery adjusted fire, targeting Soviet positions directly. Stukas screamed overhead, releasing bombs that exploded in fireballs of orange and black. The hill disappeared under smoke. The second wave advanced. This time, Germans reached the Soviet trenches. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets clashed. Grenades detonated in enclosed spaces. Men grappled in the dirt, exhausted, terrified, driven by training and desperation. By mid-afternoon, the Germans held the summit. Soviet forces counterattacked immediately. General Chuikov ordered the 13th Guards, Rifle Division, fresh reinforcements who'd crossed the Volga the night before, to retake Mamayev-Kurgan at any cost. The division commander, General Alexander Rodimtsev, didn't hesitate. His men charged up the hill in waves, shouting, "Ura!" the Russian battle cry that echoed across battlefields for centuries. They ran through German machine gun fire, through artillery barrages, through the bodies of their own dead. German defenders fired until their barrels glowed red. They threw grenades until their arms ached. But the Soviets kept coming. By nightfall, both sides held parts of the hill. The summit changed hands 4 times in 12 hours. Trenches filled with corpses. The ground was slick with blood. Wounded men lay in shell craters, calling for medics who couldn't reach them. The battle for Mamayev-Kurgan would continue for 135 days. While infantry clashed on the hill, panzer units pushed toward the grain elevator, a massive concrete complex near the Volga that served as a Soviet strongpoint. The elevator was defended by fewer than 50 men, a mix of Soviet Marines and NKVD troops. They had machine guns, rifles, grenades, and orders to hold. German tanks approached at dawn on September 18th. Panzer IIIs and IVs rumbled across open ground, turrets traversing, searching for targets. Infantry followed behind, using the tanks as mobile cover. Soviet defenders held fire until the Germans were within 100 meters. Then they opened up. Anti-tank rifles punched holes through panzer armor. Molotov cocktails shattered against hulls, igniting fuel and ammunition. Machine guns raked infantry, forcing them to ground. The Germans pulled back, called in artillery, and pounded the elevator for 2 hours. Concrete walls cracked but held. Dust filled the interior, choking defenders. The structure groaned under the bombardment. Then the panzers came again. This time, German infantry stormed the building. Room-to-room fighting was savage. Grenades exploded in narrow corridors. Men fired at shadows. The defenders fought from behind grain sacks, from stairwells, from basements flooded with water. German soldiers advanced floor by floor, clearing rooms with flamethrowers and grenades. Soviet Marines fell back, contesting every meter. Some detonated grenades when surrounded, taking Germans with them. After 3 days of fighting, the Germans captured the grain elevator. Of the 50 defenders, none survived. But those 3 days gave Chuikov time to fortify other positions. Time to bring reinforcements across the Volga. Time to turn Stalingrad into a fortress the Germans couldn't break. By the end of September, the pattern was clear. Germans would capture a building after days of fighting. Soviets would counterattack the same night. The building would change hands multiple times. Both sides would suffer horrific casualties. And when the smoke cleared, the front line had moved perhaps 100 meters. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Fighting occurred in sewers, basements, and ruins. Soldiers navigated by compass through smoke-filled streets. Snipers hunted each other across rooftops. Grenades were thrown through windows without knowing who was inside. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier in Stalingrad was 24 hours. For Germans, it wasn't much better letter. One German soldier wrote in a letter home, "We have fought for 2 weeks for a single house. The front is a corridor between burned-out rooms. From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions. Clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. The city became a graveyard with a pulse. October brought the first frost. The Volga began to freeze at its edges, not enough to cross, but enough to make the ferry runs treacherous. Ice floes battered boats. German artillery zeroed in on crossing points. Supply runs that once took 30 minutes now took hours, if they succeeded at all. Soviet soldiers huddled in ruins without winter uniforms. German troops wore the same summer tunics they'd been issued in August. Both sides suffered from the cold, but the Soviets had shorter supply lines, and they had something else: desperation married to purpose. General Paulus intensified the assault. He committed additional divisions, reorganized command structures, and demanded faster progress. Hitler was watching. The world was watching. Every day Stalingrad held became a propaganda victory for the Soviets and an embarrassment for the Reich. The focus shifted to the factory district, Red October, Barricadi, and the tractor factory. These massive industrial complexes had been converted into fortresses. Assembly lines became trenches. Foundries became bunkers. The machinery itself provided cover. On October 14th, the Germans launched their largest attack yet. 6 divisions, over 90,000 men, supported by 300 tanks and 1,000 artillery pieces, struck the Soviet positions in the factory district. The Luftwaffe flew 2,500 sorties in a single day, dropping bombs with such density that the earth trembled continuously. Soviet positions disappeared under fire. Buildings collapsed. Entire battalions were buried alive. Radio communications broke down. Units became isolated, fighting independently, clinging to fragments of rubble. German infantry advanced through the smoke, firing from the hip, clearing buildings with systematic brutality. They captured the tractor factory. They pushed into Red October. They reached the Volga riverbank in several places, cutting Soviet forces into isolated pockets. General Chvikov's headquarters was surrounded on 3 sides. Artillery shells landed within meters. Staff officers fired rifles from bunker entrances. For several hours, it seemed the 62nd Army would be annihilated, but Chvikov didn't retreat. Soviet soldiers fought from basements, attics, and rubble piles with a ferocity born of desperation. Small groups, sometimes just 3 or 4 men, held positions for days, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. One such group was led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov. Pavlov's unit captured a 4-story apartment building overlooking a key square. The Germans wanted it back. For 58 days, Pavlov and his men, Russian, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, a reflection of the Soviet Union itself, defended that building against continuous German assaults. They fortified every window, laid mines in the stairwells, set up interlocking fields of fire. When ammunition ran low, they stripped weapons from German corpses. When food ran out, supplies came across the Volga at night in small bundles. The Germans attacked Pavlov's house with infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They never took it. A German officer later noted, "We lost more men trying to take that building than we lost taking Paris." Snipers became legends in Stalingrad. Soviet sniper Vasily Zaitsev became famous for his kills, over 200 confirmed. German soldiers, including 11 enemy snipers, Zaitsev operated from positions throughout the city, moving constantly, patient and precise. The Germans sent their own expert marksman, an SS officer named Heinz Thorvald, though his identity remains historically debated. The duel between Zaitsev and Thorvald became myth, immortalized in propaganda and later in film. Whether the specific duel occurred as described doesn't matter as much as what it represented. In Stalingrad, even individual soldiers could shift morale. Every kill was a small victory. Every survival was defiance. Zaitsev trained other snipers, establishing a school in the ruins. His students carried on his methods, turning the city into a nightmare for German officers. Any German who showed rank insignia became a target. Leadership casualties mounted. Junior officers hesitated to give orders in the open. Fear is a weapon without a trigger. By early November, the German offensive stalled. Paulus's divisions were exhausted. Casualties exceeded reinforcements. Soldiers fought on through fatigue and frostbite, but the advance ground to a halt. The Soviets still held a narrow strip of land along the Volga, sometimes only a few hundred meters wide, but they held. And winter was coming. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most capable commander, had been planning a counteroffensive for weeks. Stalin gave him authority to coordinate multiple army groups. The plan was bold: encircle the German Sixth Army in a massive pincer movement, cut their supply lines, and trap them in Stalingrad. Operation Uranus. Zhukov massed over 1 million Soviet troops north and south of the city, hidden in staging areas beyond German reconnaissance. Thousands of tanks, artillery pieces and trucks moved into position under cover of darkness. The Soviets maintained strict radio silence. Deception operations suggested they were too weak to counterattack. The Germans suspected nothing. On November 19, 1942, at 0730 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire along the northern front. The barrage lasted 80 minutes. Over 3,500 guns fired simultaneously. The sound was audible 50 kilometers away. Romanian and Hungarian units, Germany's allies defending the flanks, were obliterated. Trenches collapsed. Command posts were destroyed. Communications went dead. Then Soviet tanks advanced. T-34s crashed through defensive lines, firing on the move, crushing infantry positions under their treads. Cavalry units exploited breakthroughs, racing into the rear areas. By nightfall, the northern front had collapsed. The next day, Soviet forces attacked from the south. The pincer closed on November 23rd, near the town of Kalash, 60 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army was surrounded. General Paulus received the encirclement report in disbelief. Over 250,000 German and Axis soldiers were now trapped in a pocket stretching roughly 40 kilometers east to west and 30 kilometers north to south. The perimeter was porous at first. Gaps existed where determined units might have broken through. Paulus requested permission to retreat. Hitler refused. The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. Supply will be maintained by air. No retreat. Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 300 tons of supplies daily, the minimum needed to sustain the encircled army. It was a reckless promise. The Luftwaffe had never successfully supplied a force that large by air. Weather, Soviet fighters and distance made the task nearly impossible. But Hitler believed him. The order stood: hold Stalingrad. Paulus obeyed. It was a death sentence. The airlift began on November 25th. Junkers, Ju-52 transport aircraft flew through winter storms, Soviet anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols. Some made it through. Many didn't. The Luftwaffe delivered an average of 90 tons per day, less than 1/3 of what was needed. Rations were cut. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Soldiers scavenged frozen corpses for boots and coats. Frostbite became epidemic. Men lost fingers, toes, ears to the cold. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded died from infections that would have been treatable. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened the noose. Fresh armies poured into the encirclement ring. Artillery pounded German positions daily. Soviet infantry probed defenses, identifying weak points. The pocket shrank with each passing week. Inside Stalingrad, the remaining German forces fought on. They had no choice. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was unthinkable. They fought because fighting was all that was left. Soviet forces launched continuous attacks, grinding down German strength through attrition. The Red Army was willing to trade casualties for time and space. Every day the Sixth Army remained trapped was another day it couldn't be used elsewhere. And elsewhere the war was turning. In December, German forces attempted a relief operation. General Erich von Manstein's Army Group Don attacked from the south, trying to break through the Soviet encirclement and establish a supply corridor. Operation Winter Storm came within 48 kilometers of the Stalingrad pocket. Then Soviet reserves counterattacked and the relief effort collapsed. The Sixth Army was truly alone. Christmas 1942 in Stalingrad was a frozen nightmare. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees C. Snow covered the ruins. German soldiers huddled in basements, burning furniture for warmth, wrapping their feet in newspaper and rags. They sang carols softly, trying to remember home, trying to forget where they were. Soviet soldiers weren't much warmer, but they had hope. Every day brought them closer to victory. Every day weakened the enemy. On January 8, 1943, the Soviets offered Paulus surrender terms. The offer was generous. German soldiers would be fed, clothed, and treated according to international law. Officers could keep their sidearms. The wounded would receive medical care. After the war, all prisoners would be repatriated to Germany. Paulus forwarded the offer to Hitler. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. Surrender is out of the question. The Sixth Army will do its historic duty at Stalingrad to the last man. Paulus obeyed. The final Soviet assault began on January 10th. 7 armies attacked the pocket from all sides. Over 7,000 artillery pieces fired in concentrated barrages. Soviet infantry advanced behind rolling walls of shellfire. German defenses, weakened by starvation and cold, collapsed sector by sector. By January 26th, Soviet forces reached the Volga, splitting the pocket in 2. German resistance became isolated and disorganized. Units fought independently, cut off from command and supply. Some surrendered. Others fought until they ran out of ammunition, then used their rifles as clubs, then fought with fists and stones. On January 30th, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Führer promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in a radio message. The promotion came with an unspoken message. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than be captured. Paulus did not. On January 31st, 1943, Soviet soldiers stormed his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered without resistance. The next day, February 2nd, the last German units in Stalingrad ceased fighting. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Soviet military casualties, approximately 1.1 million killed, wounded, or missing. Civilian deaths, between 40,000 and 50,000. The city itself was obliterated, over 90% of buildings destroyed. German and Axis casualties, approximately 850,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered in February 1943, only 6,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return to Germany after the war. The rest died from starvation, disease, exposure, and forced labor. The entire German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most experienced and capable formations, ceased to exist. The psychological impact was even greater than the material losses. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. For 2 years, the Wehrmacht had seemed unstoppable. France fell in 6 weeks. Poland in 1 month. The Balkans crumbled. But Stalingrad proved the Germans could be beaten, not through maneuver or clever tactics, but through sheer, brutal endurance. The Soviet Union absorbed catastrophic losses and kept fighting. For Hitler, Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end. After February 1943, Germany would never again launch a successful strategic offensive in the East. Every subsequent battle was defensive or retreat. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviets. For Stalin, Stalingrad was vindication. His not one-step-back order, his refusal to evacuate the city, his willingness to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of soldiers, all were justified by victory. The cult of personality around Stalin intensified. He became not just the leader of the Soviet Union, but its savior. The battle transformed the Soviet military. Commanders like Zhukov, Chuikov, and Rodimtsev emerged as national heroes. Tactics developed in Stalingrad's ruins, urban warfare, close combat, improvised fortifications became standard doctrine. The Red Army that emerged from Stalingrad was harder, smarter, and more confident than the army that had nearly collapsed in 1941. For ordinary soldiers, Stalingrad became a symbol. Soviet veterans wore their Stalingrad decorations with pride for the rest of their lives. German survivors rarely spoke of it at all. In the ruins, life returned slowly. Spring 1943 brought warmth and the smell of thawing corpses. The Volga flowed again, carrying bodies downstream. Soviet engineers began clearing rubble, rebuilding roads, restoring factories. The city would be rebuilt, renamed Volgograd in 1961 during de-Stalinization, then briefly renamed Stalingrad on Victory Day anniversaries. But the ruins themselves became sacred ground. On Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands countless times, a memorial complex was constructed. The centerpiece is the Motherland Calls, a towering statue of a woman raising a sword, calling her children to defense. It stands 85 meters tall, visible for miles. Beneath it lie mass graves containing thousands of unidentified soldiers, Soviet and German alike. The earth itself is a memorial. Winter became a weapon in Stalingrad, but not in the way most people think. Yes, the cold killed German soldiers who lacked winter uniforms. Yes, frostbite and exposure devastated the trapped Sixth Army, but winter was not the decisive factor. The Soviets suffered equally from the cold. They fought in the same freezing temperatures temperatures, sometimes with even less equipment. What made winter a weapon was strategic. It bought time. Time for the Soviets to bring up reinforcements. Time for the encirclement to harden. Time for the German relief efforts to fail. The real weapon was will. The Soviets were willing to pay any price to hold Stalingrad. The Germans, despite Hitler's rhetoric, were not willing to pay the price to take it. When the costs became truly unbearable, German morale broke. Soldiers surrendered not because they were beaten militarily, but because they saw no purpose in continuing. War is not won by weapons alone. It is won by the willingness to endure. Stalingrad proved that empires built on conquest and ideology crumble when faced with people defending their homes. The Wehrmacht was tactically superior, better trained, better equipped. But the Red Army fought for survival, and survival is the most powerful motivation in war. In the basement of the Univermag department store, now a museum, you can still see Paulus's command post. The walls are bare concrete. The rooms are small, claustrophobic. It's easy to imagine the final hours, staff officers burning documents, soldiers preparing for capture, Paulus sitting in silence, knowing history would judge him. He made a choice in that basement, not to commit suicide, as Hitler expected, not to fight to the death, as Nazi propaganda demanded, but to surrender, to save the lives of the men still under his command. It was an act of defiance more profound than any battle. After the war, Paulus was held in Soviet custody until 1953. He eventually renounced Nazism, testified against German war criminals at Nuremberg, and lived his final years in East Germany. Some called him a traitor. Others saw him as a man who refused to sacrifice lives for a lost cause. History remembers him as both. There is a photograph taken in February 1943, shortly after the surrender. It shows a column of German prisoners marching through the snow, guarded by Soviet soldiers. The prisoners are gaunt, hollow-eyed, wrapped in rags and blankets. Some are barefoot. Many lean on each other for support. Their faces show no emotion, not defeat, not relief, not anything. Just exhaustion so profound it erases everything else. Behind them, the ruins of Stalingrad smolder. That image captures something essential about the battle. There were no winners, only survivors and corpses. The Soviets claimed victory, and by any military definition, they won. But the cost was staggering. Entire generations were decimated, families destroyed, trauma that would echo for decades. The Germans lost everything: an army, their momentum, their confidence. The myth of invincibility shattered in Stalingrad's ruins. And the city itself? Stalingrad died so the Soviet Union could live. 78 years later, Volgograd stands as a modern city. Apartments, businesses, parks. The Volga still flows. Children play where soldiers once died. But the ground remembers. Construction workers occasionally unearth bones, helmets, unexploded ordnance. The earth gives up its dead slowly, reluctantly. On February 2nd every year, survivors gather at Mamayev Kurgan. Their numbers dwindle with each passing anniversary. Soon, there will be none left who remember the smell of smoke and blood, the sound of artillery, the cold that burned like fire. But the story remains. Stalingrad is studied in every military academy in the world, tactically as a lesson in urban warfare, strategically as a turning point, morally as a cautionary tale about the cost of absolute orders and ideological warfare. It reminds us that wars are fought by people, not just armies, that courage and cruelty coexist on every battlefield, that victory and defeat are sometimes indistinguishable from the ground level, and that some places, once fought over, are forever marked by the struggle. The sky turned black at 4 in the afternoon, not from clouds, but from wings. That's how it began. It ended with a German field marshal surrendering in a basement, an army destroyed, and a city that existed only in name. In between was everything war contains: heroism and cowardice, strategy and chaos, hope and despair. Soldiers fighting for causes they barely understood. Civilians caught between empires. Commanders making decisions that would haunt them forever. Stalingrad was not the largest battle of World War II, not the bloodiest, not the most strategically significant, but it was the moment when the inevitable became visible, when the tide turned, when winter became a weapon, not because of the cold, but because someone was willing to endure it longer. History remembers the victors, but the ground remembers everyone. If you had commanded the 6th Army in November 1942, trapped and surrounded, facing Hitler's order to hold at all costs, would you have obeyed, or would you have ordered a breakout while there was still a chance? And knowing what you know now about the cost of that obedience, does duty to orders outweigh duty to the men under your command?